timeline of the Terminator saga has been widely debated since Genisys came out. The storyline wasn't that complicated with the previous movies, but even though Genisys performed poorly in the box office, the plot has certainly provided plenty of debates on theories of the current timeline. Many have attempted to explain the timeline, but there are a lot of gaps in their arguments. In order to understand the timeline of the Terminator movies, we need to understand which time travel theory the movies are based on. One theory is called the Predestination Paradox, or Causal loop. The closest movie to actually follow this concept is the movie with the same name. Basically, the concept is that no matter what you do in the past to try and alter the future, your changes are actually what determine the future itself in an immutable timeline. This principle proposes that the local laws of physics in a region of space-time containing the time travelers cannot be any different from the local laws of physics in any other region of space-time. Thus, there is only ever one timeline for everyone. There are other theories which fall under the category of mutable timelines, which include the butterfly effect, the ripple effect, the grandfather paradox, and many others. These are the theories that most science fiction stories are based on, in one way or another. The concept of mutable timelines basically revolves around events in the past that change the future and in effect create another parallel universe. In the Terminator movies, the first iteration of time travel that we see is based on the Predestination Paradox, where, as we know, Skynet sends back a T-800 in time from 2029 to the 12th of May 1984 in order to prevent the birth of the leader of the resistance, John Connor. That singular event creates a causal loop in which the resistance react by sending back Kyle Reese, who ultimately fathers John Connor, while Skynet is created from the parts of the Terminator that were initially sent back to kill Sarah Connor. In this timeline, Skynet becomes self-aware in 1997 and Judgment Day occurs on the 12th of August 1997, 2:14 AM Eastern Standard Time. The irony is that if the Terminator was never sent back, Skynet would never have been created, Judgment Day would never have occurred, and John Connor would never have been born. However, this interdependency of the existence of both Skynet and John Connor is as far as the Predestination Paradox goes. In fact, only Kyle Reese and the T-800 are part of this causal loop, because the very moment they travel back, a ripple effect has occurred, where their very presence in the past has already altered the future. A key factor in this ripple effect is Silberman's recorded interrogation of Kyle Reese. The very notion of providing insight into future events has in itself altered the outcome of the Terminator universe. If this was a pure causal loop, then the information he provided about Skynet's defeat in the future would not alter the eventual outcome. If Skynet's time displacement equipment was destroyed by John Connor, then the timeline would hold true and no further Terminators would travel back in time, and we would never have a sequel. If nobody goes home and nobody else goes through, the T-1000 and the reprogrammed T-800 of Terminator 2 would never exist. Unless of course there was a second time displacement device, but then the Resistance had already won and the war was over. A ripple effect, however, would suggest that since Cyberdyne Systems Corporation becomes the largest supplier for the military, Skynet would have had access to police archives and would know the exact date of its demise, thus providing it the opportunity to prepare itself to avert this expected defeat. That means that the events of 2029 no longer occur. The eventual defeat and Skynet's desperation to send back a Terminator now becomes 2030. This makes sense since the delay no doubt provided the opportunity for Skynet to advance its research and prepare a higher form of technology in the T-1000 prototype, which was otherwise absent in the initial timeline. The year they depart being 2030 is evident when the reprogrammed T-800 explains it to young John Connor in 1995. And we know it's 1995 when the T-1000 searches through the police database to find John Connor's details. We see that his year of birth is 1985, and his current age is 10. This year is actually quite significant. Skynet is undoubtedly aware that tampering too much with the past may void its own existence. This is probably based on a known history of failure in 1984. This risk meant that it had to choose a year where Miles Dyson's research of the microprocessor chip would not be in jeopardy. No doubt that was the year that the military decided it had a vested interest in Cyberdyne's research. In an effort to change history, Sarah Connor, the young John Connor, and the reprogrammed T-800 changed the course of history and prevent Judgment Day in 1997. But since Miles Dyson's research had already been provided to the military, it only meant a delay in which someone else would have had to pick up where Dyson left off, and eventually create Skynet. This time, Judgment Day occurs on the 25th of July, 2004, 6:18 p.m. This is yet again evidence of the ripple effect playing a crucial part in the Terminator timeline. But just like before, with the very existence of the T-1000 and the reprogrammed T-800, the information they provide to the outcome of Skynet's potential defeat in 2030 could once again be prevented. As we find out in Terminator 3, the timeline is yet again extended, and we have our first reference of a time further into the future, with the death of John Connor on the 4th of July 2032. But as we know, the very notion of providing that information would ultimately change the course of events once more, and no doubt John Connor's death could be avoided. It took one more year before John Connor's wife, Kate Brewster, managed to send back the T-800 that killed John Connor after reprogramming it. As a response to yet another more advanced Terminator, the TX was sent back to destroy her and the other lieutenants that continued the resistance after John Connor's death. This additional year is suggested to us when the reprogrammed T-800 adjusts its internal clock from the starting year of 2033 down to the date it arrives on the 24th of July 2004. In Terminator 3, there is the notion that Skynet chose the very year of Judgment Day to send back a Terminator in order to prevent any further delay in its eventual creation. That leads us to a much simpler storyline in Terminator Salvation, when John Connor still leads the resistance against Skynet, albeit in an alternate timeline to the one his mother described to him from Kyle Reese's perspective. The ripple effect of their actions against Cyberdyne Systems and Miles Dyson in 1995 has made John Connor unsure of Skynet's own advancements. This accelerated progression is due to Skynet's knowledge of the technologies it had yet to build, including the T-1000 and the TX. That is undoubtedly why its research had moved forward to create another infiltration unit, far more advanced than the ones it had already witnessed coming back from alternate timelines. No doubt Dr. Serena Kogan's work in the Cyberdyne Systems Genetic Research Division was taken more seriously by Skynet to come up with an edge against the Resistance in the chess game of time it was playing with John Connor, which is why John had no idea what to make of Marcus Wright. Also, the fact that Skynet had intel on Kyle Reese's face recognition even at his young age in 2018 meant the game had changed significantly. Even though John Connor won a small victory at the end of Terminator Salvation, both John and Skynet were facing unknown territory in an uncertain future. But I will get back to this potential stalemate scenario later. Enter Terminator Genisys Reboot and all the complexities that come with its timelines. There is an obvious gap in the story at the moment, which can actually be explained. What we do know so far is that the movie opens with the original scenes of the unaltered 2029 when both the original T-800 and Kyle Reese were sent back. We even see the flashback of how Kyle Reese would have originally met John Connor, rather than the altered version we see in Terminator Salvation. Even John Connor's scars are identical to those of the original Terminator movie. True to Kyle Reese's words, we witness Skynet's defense grid shutting down with Terminators collapsing all around them. In the Genisys movie, we know that there was a T-1000 that was sent back to kill 9-year-old Sarah Connor, Note that the departure year would have been 2030 because that was the year the T-1000 prototype was ready for deployment, unless the prototype was ready in 2029 but never got the chance to be activated before Skynet's defeat. We also know that John Connor was sent back in 2014, as he explained to Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese when he confronted them in 2017. The main question that arises from these events is, firstly, how is it possible that we are seeing the original 2029 scene, which should no longer exist? More importantly, why do we see a version of Skynet in this timeline as a cybernetic organism? The only reason Skynet would want to embody itself in living tissue is if it were going to time travel. But how did it get to the original 2029 timeline? Going back to the potential stalemate scenario after the events of Terminator Salvation in 2018, where both Skynet and John Connor were living through an alternate timeline that neither were familiar with, we could speculate that Skynet needed a better strategy to defeat John Connor, rather than take the battles across time with technologies that had proven to be failures. We could speculate that at some time in the future, most likely further than 2030 and the technology of the T-1000, and most likely further than 2033 and the TX technology, unless of course these technologies were ready to use before these years in the alternate timeline, Skynet had made advancements in two technologies that were far greater than anything previously, namely the T-3000 and the T-5000. There is no evidence to suggest the year that these prototypes were ready. However, with these two technologies, Skynet knew it had the perfect weapons. The T-3000 was the best infiltration unit to date, because it was far better than the more primitive AI of the T-800 and the T-1000, since they lacked the human personality. Skynet would have also realized the potential of infiltrating not only the Resistance, but humanity during the peak of its civilization. The T-3000 was not prone to defiance like the version of Marcus Wright, simply because it isn't based on a hybrid of human and machine with a microchip connected to a human brain, which could be torn out, but rather that the T-3000 infected a human subject with machine phase matter to restructure and rebuild human tissue on a cellular level, completely subservient to Skynet. The technology of the T-5000 was even better. Not only did it have the capability of embodying Skynet itself, which then meant that Skynet could actually travel through time on its own without having to depend on its Terminators to do the job, but it also had the ability to create its T-3000 infiltration unit simply with a touch, meaning it could create one at any time period. Skynet would have known it needed to use them at the right time. The easiest part was to choose the perfect specimen to convert to a T-3000, and who would be a better candidate than John Connor himself? He knew the timelines and the possible futures, he knew how the Resistance operated, and he was as charismatic as any human would have been in any of the timelines. Skynet needed to get to John Connor where it knew he was at his most vulnerable. Skynet needed a scenario where it knew precisely the events that would occur in order to ensure the success of its strategy. And what better moment than during the original 2029 when John Connor was in Skynet's domain and was distracted during Kyle Reese's time travel. The question still stands, however, how did Skynet manage to revert the timeline back to the original 2029? Skynet itself needed to go back to a point in time which would have altered the timeline from its original course, and that year was 1995. Skynet would have had to destroy the T-1000 it originally sent back to that year, and would have had to destroy the reprogrammed T-800 that was sent back by John Connor. The location of their arrivals would no doubt have been known to Skynet, and no doubt the superiority of the T-5000 would have been more than capable of destroying them quickly and efficiently without having to tamper with the timeline any further. That meant that young John Connor would never have befriended the reprogrammed T-800. That meant that they would never have worked together to break out Sarah Connor out of Pescadero State Hospital for the criminally insane, and that meant they would never have destroyed Cyberdyne Systems, and Judgment Day would have occurred as it originally did in 1997. Once Skynet was successful in reverting the timeline back to the original state, it would have had to wait an entire 34 years before the moment John Connor was in the facility that held the time displacement equipment. Skynet may have also had to prevent the original Skynet of 2029 from preventing its own defeat, to allow them into the facility just as the original timeline should have happened in the causal loop. And that's when Skynet T5000 would finally carry out what it was waiting to implement for so long, and its attack would have been timed precisely because it knew the exact scenario it was dealing with. Now that Skynet had the perfect weapon of infiltration, it no longer needed Miles Dyson to stumble his way into discovering Skynet from a broken T800 microchip. All that Skynet needed to do was teach the subservient John Connor everything about Skynet's technology. In particular, knowledge of how to build the time displacement equipment, knowledge on how to create mimetic polyalloy, also known as liquid metal, and of course more importantly, knowledge on how to create a self-aware AI in order to create Skynet at a point in time when human civilization already used technology to connect everyone online. Training John Connor may have taken time. During this time, John Connor may have had to return to the Resistance to infiltrate them and celebrate their victory so as not to have a team go out in search for him at the facility. Then when the time was right, John Connor would have had to return to the facility to travel back to a point in time to create a far better version of Skynet. Skynet probably had the opportunity in the meantime to prepare the T1000 prototype that would have been completed by 2030 using the technology that was available but not activated because the original Skynet was shut down. That was when Skynet T5000 decided to send the T1000 back to 1973 to kill Sarah Connor as a child in order to tie up loose ends, and then sent John Connor back to 2014 to help Miles Dyson create Skynet. Skynet would then be made self-aware on October 2017, and Judgment Day would have occurred without the need of the interdependency between Skynet and John Connor, as was the case in the original Paradox, albeit with capabilities that were far more accelerated than the original incarnation of Skynet. It was the perfect plan. However, someone must have followed John Connor back to the facility and hid until both the T1000 and John Connor went back in time, in order to send a reprogrammed T800 back to avert their plans. It is unclear where Skynet would have been at the time. For all we know, it may have travelled back to a time to oversee its own creation, but that still remains to be seen. What we do know is that this mysterious person would have had access to the undestroyed time displacement equipment, and an endless supply of unactivated T800s that could be reprogrammed. We know of only one other person who would be capable of reprogramming a T800, and only one person who would have been close enough to John to raise suspicion in a change in his character when he returned to the Resistance victorious. That was none other than his own wife, Kate Brewster. Also, it has been deliberately left vague that in 1973, when this reprogrammed T800 saved young Sarah Connor, the T1000 was not in fact completely destroyed. It may have been searching for an entire 11 years until it realized that infiltrating Carl Reese when he arrived in 1984 was probably the best opportunity to flush out Sarah Connor, likely needing to terminate him in order to copy him. This is why we see a T1000 in 1984 attacking Carl Reese. However, as we know, Sarah Connor had been well prepared since 1973, and both the T1000 and the original T800 were successfully destroyed in 1984. There is one concept that was introduced in Terminator Genisys that creates an inconsistency in the saga regarding its time travel theory. That is the nexus point in the time flow and the memories that suddenly appeared for Carl Reese. Perhaps this was just an attempt from the movie makers to provide an easy explanation as to why the protagonists knew that Judgment Day was now 2017. Technically speaking, they didn't even need to travel through time. They simply just needed to wait. But again, that is probably just a Hollywood twist. Regardless, When Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor travel to 2017 and successfully avert Judgment Day, this inadvertently removed John Connor entirely from existence. The exact time and date that they were to have intimacy back in 1984 was the only opportunity for John Connor to exist, and now it has become an impossibility. Any intimate relationship they would have now would provide a different child, even if they called the child John. For all we know, their child may even be a girl. Moreover, the corrupted John Connor's involvement in creating Skynet with a far more superior technology also inadvertently removed the very concept of a T-800. There is one very interesting concept in this movie that hasn't been brought up in previous time travel movies, and that is what John Connor called the exiles in time, when Sarah Connor says that he cannot kill his own parents. Other movies have made the attempt to explain the grandfather paradox with a little Hollywood trickery to make a person magically vanish. However, the concept of being marooned in an altered timeline regardless of their origin is a very interesting notion. It means that since they already exist, they cannot suddenly unexist. This would also explain why John Connor didn't suddenly disappear in 2029 the moment the original T-800 was sent back before Kyle Reese, which would have otherwise meant that the past would have been altered and their entire world transformed around them before Kyle Reese even had the chance to travel back. This is evidence that the different timelines are essentially parallel universes, where a time portal in one timeline is connected to only one alternate timeline, as is suggested when Kyle Reese arrives to a time that is altered because the same time portal was used to alter the same timeline's history in 1973, regardless of which order the time travelers depart from the original timeline. Again, this concept makes the Nexus point an inconsistent argument with the sudden dual memory that Kyle Reese acquires. There is also another fallacy that is important to note, and that revolves around the existence of Kyle Reese, whose birth year is 2004. In one timeline, that year falls well after the original Judgment Day of 1997, and in another, it falls well before the Judgment Day of 2017. Unless his parents met before 1997, it would be an incredible coincidence that they met under significantly different circumstances. In either case, it would also have been an incredible coincidence that their intimacy would have occurred at the exact same time and date in both timelines. Apart from that, there are numerous discrepancies, particularly in Terminator 3 with regards to references of age, birth years, and past events. But otherwise, the Terminator saga maintains consistency in the main story's timeline at least. With 2 more movies on the way, it should help tie up most of the loose ends. And it would definitely be interesting to see what the conclusion will be to all of this. I hope you enjoyed this explanation of the timeline for the Terminator saga, and I also hope that this clarifies things a little more for all you Terminator die-hard fans. Hasta la vista.